The chandeliers burned like captive constellations above the ballroom, scattering light across marble floors polished to a merciless shine. Music drifted from the gallery in long, trembling phrases, and beneath it moved the careful pageantry of society, silk skirts whispering, gloved hands brushing, voices softened by wealth and certainty. It was a room designed to celebrate harmony, yet its true talent lay in exclusion, and it practiced that art with exquisite precision. At the edge of the gathering she stood, perfectly visible and entirely alone, her presence acknowledged only by the space others chose not to occupy. She had dressed with deliberation, selecting elegance that spoke of restraint rather than invitation. The pale fabric of her gown caught the light without demanding it, and a simple strand of pearls rested at her throat like a remembered promise. Every detail had been chosen to assert composure, to signal that she still belonged to herself even if the room no longer claimed her. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted, her expression calm enough to pass for indifference. Only she knew the discipline required to maintain such stillness when the air itself seemed to murmur her disgrace. Weeks earlier, her name had been spoken with anticipation, paired with his in tones of congratulation. Now it traveled differently, borne on sighs and sidelong looks, reshaped into a lesson. He was there tonight, radiant in his good fortune, his arm offered proudly to the young woman whose dowry had eclipsed affection. The heiress laughed easily, unburdened by doubt, and the sound carried across the floor like a small triumph. When the former fiancé bent his head to her, the gesture struck with the intimacy of habit, and the sight lodged painfully behind the heroine's eyes. She did not turn away. To do so would have been to admit defeat, and she had resolved, at least for this evening, not to yield. Conversation faltered around her, rising again only after she passed. She received greetings polished to courtesy and empty of warmth, replies shaped to end exchanges swiftly. Pity hovered close, perfumed and polite, while cruelty hid behind smiles sharpened by curiosity. She caught fragments as one catches thorns, unfortunate, foolish, inevitable. Each word pressed against her with delicate persistence. Yet she answered graciously, never allowing her voice to waver, never offering the satisfaction of visible pain. In a society that prized appearances above truth, she understood that survival depended upon the careful stewardship of one's face. When the orchestra paused between sets, dance cards emerged like instruments of judgment. She waited as custom dictated, hands folded, posture impeccable. One by one, couples formed and drifted toward the floor, and no gentleman approached her. The blank spaces on her card grew heavier with every passing moment, each empty line an unspoken verdict. She had anticipated this humiliation, rehearsed her endurance for it, yet anticipation did not blunt the ache. The music resumed, and the room filled with motion, skirts swirling past her like indifferent tides. A laugh brushed her ear and vanished. Somewhere crystal chimed against crystal. She remained still, an ornament no longer admired, an object lesson displayed without commentary. Her thoughts moved with an unwanted clarity. She saw herself reflected in society's logic, reduced to a cautionary figure, the woman who had been deemed insufficient when measured against gold. Love, she understood now, was treated as a negotiable asset, and loyalty as a sentiment easily replaced by sums tallied on paper. The heat of shame crept beneath her collar, a flush she mastered with practiced calm. She would not cry here. She would not grant the room that indulgence. Instead, she turned toward the tall windows where rain streaked the glass, tracing silver paths down the darkness beyond, as though the night itself were weeping in her stead. It was then that she felt the weight of another's attention, distinct from the glances that had pursued her all evening. This gaze did not skim or appraise. It settled, steady and unintrusive, as if it recognized a boundary and respected it. She looked back and found a man standing slightly apart from the crowd, his presence marked not by ostentation but by control. He wore dark evening dress cut with restraint, and his posture suggested authority worn lightly, without the need for display. The surrounding noise seemed to fold inward around him, creating a pocket of quiet that traveled with his stillness. She did not know his name or title, only the impression he made upon her senses. His expression held neither triumph nor pity, neither curiosity sharpened to hunger nor judgment disguised as concern. There was an attentiveness there, grave and composed, that unsettled her more than overt scrutiny would have done. For a moment they regarded one another across the breadth of the floor, and in that moment she felt, inexplicably, seen rather than surveyed. He crossed the distance with deliberate ease, his steps unhurried, his path unchallenged. It was a manner perfected by those accustomed to command, yet it carried no arrogance. She sensed his approach as one senses a change in weather, subtle but undeniable. When he stopped before her, he inclined his head in a bow exact enough to be meaningful, a courtesy rendered with genuine respect. "Madam," he said, his voice low and even, each syllable measured. "May I have the honor of this dance?" The question fell into the charged air and seemed to draw every whisper toward it. Nearby faces turned, surprise flickering through practiced composure. She felt the sudden weight of attention, the delicate peril of choice. To decline would confirm her exile, sealing her isolation with her own hand. To accept would invite speculation, perhaps scandal, and she had endured enough of both. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, yet his gaze did not press. He waited, offering not insistence but possibility. She met his eyes and found there no demand, only an acknowledgement of her agency. That, more than courtesy itself, steadied her resolve. "You may," she replied, her voice controlled, a thread drawn taut and unbroken. He extended his arm. She placed her hand upon his sleeve and became aware of the quiet strength beneath the cloth, of the steadiness that did not seek to possess. Around them the room held its breath. They moved together into the light, and the orchestra, as if sensing the shift, lifted into a fuller cadence. The dance unfolded with restrained elegance, a conversation conducted through timing and space. He led without domination, allowing her the dignity of her own balance, responding rather than imposing. She found herself breathing more freely, her movements unburdened by self-consciousness. The murmur of the crowd receded, replaced by the measured rise and fall of the music and the awareness of partnership that asked nothing beyond the present moment. As they turned, she glimpsed familiar faces watching with new interest. Assumptions adjusted, judgments recalibrated. The former fiancé looked up from his companion, surprise cracking his complacence, and for the briefest instant she saw uncertainty cloud his satisfaction. It was a small victory, perhaps an illusory one, yet it warmed her like a candle shielded from drafts. When the final note faded, the man released her hand at once, as though mindful of the line propriety demanded. He bowed again, precise and unembellished. "Thank you," he said simply, and in those two words she heard neither promise nor claim, only acknowledgement. He stepped away, merging back into the crowd with the same quiet authority that had marked his arrival. The rain intensified against the windows, drumming a quiet insistence that echoed her unsettled thoughts. She sensed dimly that such moments were rare in a woman's life, that they arrived unannounced and departed altered, leaving behind a changed landscape. Whatever his reasons, whatever his name, the man's choice had drawn a line through the evening, dividing what had been from what might yet be endured. She straightened her shoulders, feeling the old ache give way to something sharper, more alert, and wondered whether dignity, once challenged, might learn to defend itself. Tonight, she realized, endurance was no longer her only weapon. Attention itself could be turned, redirected, made to serve. The thought unsettled her, yet it also kindled a cautious resolve, like a spark sheltered in the hollow of her chest. By the following evening, the dance had already become legend, polished and distorted by repetition, and her name traveled with it through drawing rooms scented with bergamot and judgment. Doors opened more readily for her, yet conversation stiffened upon her arrival, as though courtesy itself were uncertain how to behave. She felt eyes measuring the space she now occupied, weighing it for legitimacy, and with each glance she sensed both danger and possibility entwined. The man who had crossed the floor for her remained unnamed, which only sharpened the fascination, for mystery was the most combustible currency society possessed. He appeared again at the opera, seated not beside her but within her sight, his presence an anchor she neither sought nor resisted. When applause rose, he did not look toward her, yet she felt the steadiness of his awareness like a hand placed lightly at her back. The gesture he offered this time was smaller and therefore more perilous. A program delivered by an attendant, its margin marked neatly where her favorite aria would swell. She accepted it with a nod, aware that such attentions, when witnessed, acquired meanings never intended. Whispers followed. Some suggested gratitude had tempted him. Others insisted he was merely amused. None imagined benevolence without motive. She moved carefully, her replies measured, her gratitude expressed without intimacy, for she understood how swiftly a woman could be recast from victim to conspirator. Still, a warmth persisted, unwelcome yet undeniable, kindled by the fact that he neither claimed her nor retreated. His restraint was its own provocation. In the days that followed, tokens arrived without announcement. A book she had once admired appeared upon her table, its leather softened by use, its pages marked at a passage on endurance. A carriage drew up beside her in sudden rain, the driver bearing instructions spoken with unmistakable authority. Each kindness landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples she could not control. Gratitude wrestled with alarm, for she knew the cost of being seen. Society responded as it always did, by inventing narratives. Her former fiancé's circle grew watchful, their civility edged with inquiry. Invitations came laced with curiosity, their warmth conditional upon revelation. She was asked questions that were not questions at all, and she learned to answer them obliquely, protecting a connection she did not yet understand. At night, alone, she weighed the balance between shelter and exposure, and slept lightly as though vigilance itself might preserve her dignity. When at last he spoke to her again, it was in a conservatory fragrant with damp earth and blossoms coaxed into obedience by glass and heat. He greeted her with the same exact courtesy, remarking upon nothing that had passed between them. They spoke instead of music, of weather, of the delicate tyranny required to make beauty bloom on command. Beneath the civility, meaning accumulated, unspoken and deliberate. She sensed, with a tightening breath, that he was offering her a place defined not by possession but by protection. The scandal arrived softly. A matron's laugh lingered too long. A newspaper hinted at an attachment unnamed yet unmistakable. The shift was subtle but inexorable, and she felt herself carried toward a threshold she had not chosen. Anger stirred, not at him, but at a world that would not permit kindness without consequence. When she finally looked up to meet his gaze across the crowded room, she saw apology there and resolve. Whatever storm gathered, it had already begun. She became acutely aware of how every surface reflected her altered standing, mirrors repeating her image with interrogative brightness, polished silver pausing in attentive hands. Servants inclined their heads a fraction deeper, not in deference but in acknowledgement of rumor's weight. Friends approached with rehearsed candor, seeking confirmation disguised as concern, and she offered none, guarding silence as one guards a flame. The man remained consistent, appearing where propriety allowed, absent where it forbade, shaping restraint into a language she slowly learned to read. At a luncheon flooded with winter light, a place was set for her beside him, the arrangement announced without explanation. The proximity was brief yet charged, his sleeve brushing hers as porcelain passed between them, a contact so fleeting it might have been imagined. Conversation flowed around them, and beneath it ran a current of attention sharpened to a blade. She spoke little, listening for what was not said, while he guided the table with questions that granted others importance, never claiming the center. Her former fiancé observed from across the room, his smile fixed, his eyes restless. She felt the old hurt stir, then settle, altered by distance. Power, she realized, was not loud. It resided in the capacity to choose one's silences. When the meal ended, he rose first, ensuring her chair before his own departure, a courtesy that resonated more deeply than any declaration. She watched him go, aware that his care, however measured, was reshaping her fate. That evening, a note arrived, unsealed yet unmistakably private, requesting her company for a conversation conducted within the strict bounds of respect. No promise was offered, no explanation extended, only the assurance of discretion. She held the paper until its edges warmed, understanding that acceptance would advance the story others told of her, and refusal would surrender authorship entirely. Outside, the rain began again, steady and insistent, and she knew, with a clarity that frightened her, that the next step would not be danced in public. Instead, it would be taken in shadow, where choices hardened into destiny and restraint revealed its cost. She folded the note carefully, feeling the quiet weight of consequence settle into her palms. Whatever he intended to say, it would demand more than endurance, more than patience. It would ask for courage. As the rain traced the windows like counting fingers, she understood that protection, once offered, always required a price, and tomorrow she would learn whose. The moment approached, quiet yet immense, altering everything she believed about safety and survival waiting. The consequences would soon reveal themselves. She arrived at the appointed hour with the measured calm of one who has already rehearsed the worst. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, its corridors softened by lamplight and the faint scent of beeswax and old paper. A servant showed her into a library warmed by firelight, then withdrew without comment, closing the door with discretion that sounded like finality. She stood alone for a moment, hands clasped, aware of the soft ticking of a clock and the deeper rhythm of her own pulse answering it. He rose from beside the hearth as she entered fully into the room. The flames caught the planes of his face, sharpening his features, lending gravity to his stillness. He did not approach at once. Instead, he bowed as formally as he had in the ballroom, acknowledging the risk she had taken by coming. "I thank you for granting me your time," he said, his voice low, carrying neither urgency nor entitlement. "I wish to speak where words might be allowed their proper weight." She inclined her head in return and chose a chair opposite him, positioning herself where the light fell evenly, refusing the shelter of shadow. "I am listening," she replied. The simplicity of the sentence surprised her with its steadiness. Listening, she realized, was itself an act of courage. For a moment he studied the fire, as though gathering his thoughts from its measured burn. When he spoke again, it was not to explain his actions but to define their limits. He told her he would not insult her with false romance, nor bind her with promises lightly made. What he offered, he said, was respect rendered publicly and privately, a name that could shield her from the more casual brutalities of the world. He spoke of marriage not as conquest or rescue, but as an accord, carefully entered, scrupulously honored. She listened without interruption, her attention fixed upon the restraint in his tone. There was power in his words, unmistakable and controlled, yet also a deliberate narrowing, as though he had trimmed away every impulse that might overwhelm. When he finished, silence filled the room, thickened by the fire's sigh. She felt the familiar ache rise, the memory of vows spoken once before with equal gravity and far less truth. Her hands tightened together, then relaxed. "I have already been made an object of transaction," she said at last, her voice quiet but precise. "I will not be again." The confession cost her more than she expected, and she allowed herself no adornment of it. She spoke of the betrayal without naming it, of the humiliation that lingered like a stain she could not scrub away. Each word loosened something knotted within her chest, pain reshaped into clarity. He listened as she had, without interruption, without defense. When she finished, he met her gaze fully. "I would not ask you to forget what you have endured," he said, "only to consider whether dignity might be preserved by choosing the terms of your future, rather than permitting others to set them." His honesty unsettled her more than persuasion would have done. He did not deny advantage. He acknowledged it, framing it as something to be handled with care. She rose and crossed to the window, drawn by the dark reflection it offered. Outside, the night lay hushed, rain threatening but withheld, as though the sky itself hesitated. She saw her own face mirrored faintly, older than it had been weeks ago, sharpened by disappointment and resolve. The thought came unbidden that endurance alone was a narrow life, that survival without agency slowly eroded the soul. When she turned back, her decision was already forming, tentative yet unmistakable. "If I were to accept," she said, choosing each word as one might step across ice, "it would be without illusion. I would expect candor and I would offer the same. I would not be possessed." Her voice steadied as she spoke, strengthened by the sound of her own conditions. He stood as well, closing the distance by a measured pace, stopping well short of impropriety. "I would accept no other terms," he replied. For the first time, something warmer flickered through his composure, not triumph but relief, carefully contained. He extended no hand, made no claim upon her body or her future beyond what she might willingly grant. They spoke then of practicalities, of how such an arrangement might be announced, managed, endured. Each detail grounded the decision, anchoring it against impulse. Yet beneath the discussion ran a quieter current, an awareness of what was being risked by both. She sensed, though he did not say it, that his offer carried costs of its own, that secrecy had already shaped his life into careful compartments. At last, the fire burned lower, and the clock marked the passage of time with renewed insistence. He thanked her again, not for agreement but for consideration. As she gathered her cloak, he added, almost as an afterthought, "There are aspects of my position you will come to know should you choose this path. Not all at once." The admission hovered between them, weighted with implication. She paused at the door, her hand upon the latch, and looked back at him. In that moment she understood that she was stepping toward shelter that might also be a threshold to deeper exposure. "Then I will choose with open eyes," she said. Outside, the rain finally began to fall, soft at first, then steady, sealing the night around her. As she descended the steps, the house behind her seemed to hold its breath, and she felt, with a mix of fear and resolve, that whatever power he guarded would soon press upon her life, demanding not silence but partnership. The announcement, when it came, was delivered with a restraint that belied its force, printed in modest type and spoken aloud with carefully neutral tones. Her name appeared beside his not as a romantic flourish but as a fact, a union presented as settled rather than celebrated. Society inhaled collectively, surprised less by the marriage itself than by the calm with which it was declared. She felt the shift immediately, the subtle reorientation of glances that no longer asked whether she belonged but how firmly. In that quiet recalibration lay both safety and a new, unfamiliar peril. The ceremony was small, precise, conducted beneath a winter sky that held its light like breath. She wore ivory unadorned by excess, her veil simple, her expression composed. He stood beside her with the same deliberate stillness that had first distinguished him, his presence and assurance without display. Vows were exchanged without flourish, words chosen for clarity rather than sentiment. Yet beneath the formality she felt a current of resolve pass between them, an agreement deeper than what was spoken aloud. When the final blessing fell, it did not sound like an ending but an opening. Marriage altered the shape of her days more than their content. She moved through rooms that were larger, quieter, attended by servants trained to anticipate needs before they were voiced. Letters arrived bearing crests she did not yet recognize, sealed with authority she could sense without understanding. He was attentive without intrusion, present without possession, his courtesy unchanged by the legality that now bound them. At times she wondered if this equilibrium was fragile, maintained by vigilance rather than ease, yet she found comfort in its consistency. Society adjusted its posture toward her with remarkable speed. Invitations multiplied, warmer now, their curiosity sharpened by respect. Whispers did not vanish, they merely changed direction, speculating upon his motives, her influence, the nature of a match so carefully arranged. She learned to navigate these waters with increasing assurance, her voice steady, her silences purposeful. Dignity, once defended, began to accrue interest, and she felt herself growing into the role afforded her, not as ornament but as presence. He watched these transformations with a restraint that sometimes unsettled her. In private moments, he offered guidance without instruction, answering questions fully yet never volunteering what was not asked. Their conversations remained deliberate, shaped by mutual caution, yet threaded with an intimacy born of shared risk. She sensed that his life, like hers, had been partitioned by necessity, that trust was something he extended sparingly, with care. The marriage, she realized, was not merely a shelter for her, but a calculated exposure for him. The first crack appeared during a formal dinner, when a visiting dignitary bowed to him with a deference that exceeded protocol. The exchange was brief, easily overlooked, yet she felt the air around the table tighten. Later, alone, she asked him about it, keeping her tone light, her curiosity measured. He answered without evasion, yet with omissions she could feel rather than name. "There are responsibilities," he said, "that do not announce themselves until they must." The sentence lingered between them, weighted with significance. As weeks passed, the pattern repeated. Messengers arrived at odd hours. Guards appeared where before there had been none. Decisions were made swiftly, quietly, with consequences she could sense in the atmosphere of the house. She was treated always with respect, informed of what touched her directly, yet she felt herself brushing against the edges of a larger design. It was not fear that stirred within her, but a sharpening awareness that the life she had entered carried a gravity not yet fully revealed. Her former fiancé receded from her thoughts, rendered insignificant by distance and irrelevance. In his place rose a different preoccupation, the question of who she had married and how fully she wished to know him. One evening, as they stood together in a gallery lined with maps, she traced the outlines absently, noting borders that seemed to shift beneath her gaze. He watched her from the corner of his eye, his expression unreadable. "You are observant," he said not unkindly. She met his gaze and replied, "I would rather understand than be protected from understanding." That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake listening to the house breathe around her, aware of how swiftly her fortunes had turned, and how incomplete her knowledge remained. Protection, she had learned, could be another form of distance, and distance, however well-intentioned, carried its own risks. When morning came, pale and cold, she rose with a resolve that surprised her with its firmness. She would not remain a guest in her own life. She found him in his study, light slanting across papers arranged with meticulous care. He looked up as she entered, reading her expression before she spoke. There was no anger in her voice, only a steadiness born of choice. "I accepted this marriage to reclaim my dignity," she said. "I will not preserve it by ignorance." The words landed softly, yet they reshaped the space between them. He regarded her for a long moment, weighing what was asked against what had been guarded. At last he nodded once, a gesture of concession and respect. "Very well," he said. "Then you must be prepared to see beyond comfort." He moved aside, revealing a document marked with seals unfamiliar and unmistakably sovereign. She stepped closer, her breath catching as recognition dawned, not of detail but of scale. Power, vast and carefully concealed, lay before her, and with it the understanding that her marriage was not merely personal but political, binding her to a reach that extended far beyond the walls she now called home. The truth settled between them like a held breath, invisible yet absolute, and she felt its weight press upon every promise she had accepted. He did not soften the revelation, nor did he dramatize it. He simply allowed it to exist, sovereign and unyielding. In that moment she understood that power, when restrained, was more frightening than spectacle. Her first instinct was not awe but distance, a step taken inward to measure herself against the magnitude now revealed. Marriage had given her shelter, yet it had also bound her to consequences that reached beyond comfort or choice alone, irrevocably so. She asked for time not because she doubted him, but because understanding demanded solitude. He granted it without protest, a further proof that his authority did not depend upon urgency. Alone, she walked the long corridors, noting how maps, ledgers and guarded doors now spoke directly to her fate. Shame from her past stirred, then receded, replaced by something sterner. She had been discarded once for wealth. Now wealth, multiplied into dominion, stood beside her bed. The symmetry was cruel yet clarifying. It demanded a response equal to its scale. She refused to shrink again. Not ever, not now anymore. When she returned to him, dusk had gathered, blurring the windows into mirrors of firelight. She did not accuse him of deception, she accused him of caution. Her voice did not tremble as she spoke of fear, nor did it harden when she spoke of anger. She told him that love, once betrayed, learned to recognize concealment as danger. If he wished for partnership, it must be complete. Protection without truth, she said, was merely another form of exile. She would not live unseen again. Even crowns required witnesses, especially the heaviest ones. He listened, unmoving, absorbing every word spoken. For the first time, his composure fractured not into anger, but into something perilously close to humility. He confessed that concealment had been survival, that empires endured through silence more often than force. Enemies listened everywhere, he said, and affection was the most dangerous signal of all. To bind her openly had been both shield and risk. He had hoped to spare her the weight of his reach, even as he drew her within it. The paradox, once named, stood starkly between them. She absorbed this without yielding ground. Understanding did not require surrender. It required mutual courage, plainly shared. Their argument never rose in volume, yet it reshaped the room. She declared that if she were to stand beside him, it would be as a conscious participant, not a sheltered emblem. He answered that partnership would expose her to danger he could not fully soften. They circled the truth carefully, neither retreating. At last he offered her access, not as indulgence but obligation. Knowledge, he warned, would demand loyalty measured not by obedience, but by judgment exercised under pressure. She accepted the cost without flinching. Dignity demanded risk, always had. Her silence confirmed the bargain. He nodded gravely. What? Days followed, marked by revelation rather than romance. She read dispatches, learned names spoken only in sealed rooms, traced decisions whose echoes crossed borders. The scale did not intoxicate her, it sobered her. She recognized patterns of sacrifice, understood how easily people became abstractions when distance intervened. He watched her learn with an expression that blended pride and caution, correcting when needed, withholding when necessary. In the quiet hours, they spoke of ethics more than affection, discovering alignment where passion had not yet been named. Respect deepened before desire dared surface. This reversal unsettled them both. Neither admitted it aloud. Resistance came, as it always did, from beyond the walls. Rumors hardened into threats, veiled in diplomatic language. She saw now how marriage had placed her visibly within his defenses, a figure enemies might test. Fear touched her then, cold and exact, but it did not master her. Instead, she felt anger sharpen into resolve. If she were to be targeted, she would not be ornamental prey. She trained herself to listen, to read silences, to weigh consequence, adapting with deliberate speed. He neither forbade nor discouraged this transformation. Such agency, he believed, strengthened survival. It bound them tighter. Quietly. Their closeness shifted almost imperceptibly from caution toward trust. One evening, as lamplight trembled, he reached for her hand, not in claim but in acknowledgement of shared burden. She did not withdraw. The contact was brief, weighted by restraint, yet it altered the air between them. She realized then that affection, delayed, had grown dense and deliberate, like wood seasoned for strength. Love, when it arrived, would not be reckless. It would be chosen again and again against fear. This knowledge steadied her more than vows. It promised endurance beyond ceremony. Power watched but did not intrude. Yet, still, waiting. The world outside shifted restlessly, borders tightening, alliances fraying. She sensed an approaching reckoning, not yet defined but inevitable. He prepared with quiet precision, and she recognized that preparation now included her. Documents crossed her desk bearing implications she understood fully. Choice replaced ignorance as her daily companion. She no longer wondered whether she had married above herself. She understood she had married into responsibility. The girl abandoned for fortune felt distant, transformed into a woman measured by resolve rather than favor. Yet the cost of this ascent loomed. Every elevation invited sharper falls. She braced herself accordingly. Without illusion. On a night edged with wind, he told her of a council soon to convene, of decisions that would ripple outward with unforgiving force. He spoke her name within those plans not as symbol but as voice. The trust implicit in that inclusion tightened her chest. She understood then that love had already crossed its quiet threshold, braided with power and peril. As she looked at him, she saw not shelter, but partnership offered without retreat. Beyond the windows, the world waited, listening. Its response would test everything they had chosen. She did not look away. Nor did he. Ever. The council chamber was lit like a stage prepared for judgment, tall candles throwing long, unsteady shadows across the table where power customarily pretended to be reason. Maps lay unfurled, borders traced and retraced by hands that had never bled for them. When she entered beside him, conversation thinned, then stopped. She felt the collective appraisal immediately, not of her presence, which had been anticipated, but of her composure, which unsettled them. This was the moment she had been trained for, not by tutors, but by humiliation, restraint, and the long schooling of silence. He took his seat without ceremony, and she remained standing a breath longer than protocol demanded. It was not defiance, merely choice, and it was noticed. When she sat, it was with intention, her back straight, her gaze level. She no longer searched the room for approval. Instead, she assessed. The faces around the table reflected calculation, skepticism, and a flicker of something more dangerous. Relief that she appeared calm and therefore perhaps controllable. They were wrong. Calm was not compliance. Calm was readiness. The first challenge came veiled as courtesy. A question about her comfort, her adjustment to new responsibilities, phrased gently enough to appear considerate. She answered without warmth, without apology, acknowledging the weight of her role and affirming her preparedness to bear it. The man who had asked leaned back, dissatisfied. Another pressed further, invoking tradition, suggesting that visibility carried risk, that discretion had preserved stability for generations. She listened fully before speaking, then replied with precision, noting that stability maintained through invisibility was indistinguishable from stagnation, and that threats multiplied most efficiently where silence was mistaken for weakness. The chamber shifted. He watched her from beside, offering no intervention, only presence. This, she understood, was his declaration. He had not brought her here to be defended, but to be revealed. The argument deepened, sharpening into lines drawn not on maps but between philosophies. When accusations emerged, carefully phrased doubts about loyalty, about origin, about suitability, she did not retreat. She named them for what they were, fear of change disguised as prudence. The words landed heavily. She felt the echo of her former life in that instant, the girl once dismissed for lacking worth beyond dowry. She spoke now from that memory, transforming it into authority. When the decisive moment arrived, it came not with raised voices, but with an ultimatum delivered quietly. Concession would preserve peace, they said. Visibility would invite attack. A figure at the table suggested she be withdrawn from future councils, shielded for her own safety. It was framed as kindness. She recognized the trap instantly. To accept would unravel everything she had claimed. She rose slowly, her hands resting lightly on the table, grounding herself in its solidity. "I was not brought here to be spared," she said, her voice steady enough to still the air. "I was brought here to be accountable." She spoke then of dignity as a force rather than an ornament, of power that answered to conscience rather than custom. She reminded them that empires did not fall from exposure, but from rot concealed too long. Each sentence was measured, necessary, sharpened by lived experience. She did not plead. She did not threaten. She simply refused to be reduced. Silence followed, heavy and complete. She felt it pass through her, not as fear but as confirmation. At last he stood. When he spoke, his words were few, but they carried the weight of finality. He affirmed her place without qualification, naming her not as wife, but as equal counsel. The choice, he said, was no longer theoretical. Was made. Those unwilling to adapt were free to step aside. No one did. Power, she had learned, often yielded when confronted with clarity. The aftermath unfolded swiftly. Orders were given, alliances recalibrated, messages dispatched. She participated without hesitation, her voice now integrated into the rhythm of command. When the council adjourned, the chamber emptied more quietly than it had filled. Outside, dawn pressed pale against the windows, the world shifting with it. She felt the fatigue then, sudden and profound, the cost of standing unshielded. He offered his arm, and this time she accepted without calculation. They walked together through corridors that no longer felt borrowed. In the privacy of his study, he turned to her, and the restraint he had maintained all night finally eased. "You were formidable," he said, not with pride alone but with wonder. She met his gaze, seeing there not dominance but partnership fully realized. "So were you," she replied. The simplicity of the exchange carried more intimacy than any declaration spoken earlier might have done. He reached for her then, not out of triumph but necessity, and she allowed herself the closeness she had earned. The embrace was brief, grounding, real. In it, she felt the convergence of all that had brought her here, the loss, the shame, the choice to stand rather than disappear. When they parted, it was with understanding rather than promise. Love, she knew now, did not rescue. It witnessed. It stood firm when retreat was easier. Beyond the windows, the city stirred, unaware that its future had tilted slightly on the axis of one woman's refusal to be diminished. She looked out at it with clear eyes, knowing challenges would come, sharper and less forgiving. But she also knew this: she was no longer the one traded away. She was the one who chose, and in choosing claimed not just a husband, not just a title, but her place at the center of consequence. The empire would test her. She was ready.